the experts. Tina Cinder, one of the doctors here at the Sean Parker Center, runs this. And today I'm going to be talking about risk factors for food allergy. And if I sort of go too fast, stop, interrupt, because it's something that I think is super exciting. We have identified several risk factors for food allergy as a species, and I'm going to focus on a couple, and I'm happy to take questions at the end. Okay, so I'm Kate Fast, and we are going to focus a bit on the LEAP study because that put into words a lot of things that people had suspected, and it gave us specific data that have influenced guidelines that really seem to be making a positive difference. This is the LEAP baby. Many of you, because you're interested in topics like today's, have seen this slide, and it's something that we'll touch on again several times in this study. So this was the LEAP study. It was published in the New England Journal, and it looked at introduction and delay of peanut. And what got us there was an increase worldwide in peanut allergy and sort of an unclear association of exposure to peanuts with frank peanut allergy. In 1998, the UK NHS asked nursing mothers and pregnant women not to eat peanuts, tree nuts, shrimp, all these highly allergenic foods, especially if they themselves came from families that had food allergies. And without much data, the WHO later suggested that every country did this. And there was some pushback. There was pushback from some countries because these were recommendations that were not based in population studies. And there was pushback from specific countries because they introduced these allergens early. In America, when you want a child to start developing a pincer grip and work on feeding him or herself, we use Cheerios, or we use those small crackers. And in Indonesia, the cracker is shrimp flavored. And as most of you know, because you're in this webinar and your pediatrician or your allergist may have sent you to buy some, in Israel, they use Bombo, which is sort of a puffy peanut flavored snack. And the first country that had a boost in peanut allergy after these guidelines were adopted was the United Kingdom. And so better data were acquired. And what the LEAP study did, it was spearheaded by Gideon Lack in London, who looked in particular at Israel, where there was no great increase in food allergy, particularly peanut, in recent years, and the Jewish population around where he lived, where there had been. And in truth, at that moment in time, there had been a doubling of peanut allergy in the West. And the LEAP study looked at what factors affect this. After screening, the LEAP study had 640 infants. These were all babies who were at least 4 months old. Every single one was less than 11 months old. And they all had either severe eczema or egg allergy or both. And as most of my patients know, just because I drone on and on about it, if I had taken a book off a shelf 100 years ago, one had to have a concomitant diagnosis of egg allergy in order to be labeled as having eczema, with the same old eczema findings we use now in order to have that diagnosis at the turn of the last century. So all of these kids had a skin prick test, and they were routed into two groups. One had no wheal with peanut skin prick testing, and one had a wheal between 1 and 4 millimeters. And the kids who had larger wheals than that didn't make it to randomization. So we're talking about the 640 babies after randomization. And so of these two groups, the group that had no wheal with skin prick testing and the one that had the 1 to 4 millimeter wheal, the advice was, and this is randomized, so it's about a 50-50 split in each group, avoid peanut altogether for the duration of this study, or start peanut basically now. And the outcome was going to be how many of the children in each group at 5 years had peanut allergy. So it's a pretty clever study. And of these children, the ones who had a negative skin prick test, who were randomized to avoid peanut, had, as you can see, 6-7 times the incidence of peanut allergy as the children whose parents were told just get the peanut in. And how often and what the vehicle is, that varied, because those of you who have children or who yourselves have peanut allergy, to introduce a nut butter is a pretty disgusting thing. It's unfamiliar, the texture's tough. And in my clinic, I often use candy, peanut flavored candies. And then looking at the other group, the children who had a positive skin prick test, half went to peanut avoidance and half went to early introduction. And you can see you have basically a 10% incidence of peanut allergy in those children who had the small prick test, but who were told to eat peanut anyway. Whereas over a third of the kids who had that small positive prick test and were told no peanuts had peanut allergies. So going into this study, those 98 children were more or less the same. And what seems to have made the difference was the early introduction of peanuts. So that was the massive take home. And what's really fascinating is when you look at adverse events, because with food allergy, we're terrified about a bad outcome. We have equivalent adverse events among the groups who were doing early peanut introduction and the groups who were avoiding, whether or not they had the skin prick test positivity. So the real take home is that second to bottom bullet point of the children with the positive skin prick test, a third went on to develop peanut allergy when they were avoiding it, and fewer than 10% did when they were consuming it. So this is the schematic of how children were routed, and we can come back and look at that, but I think we sort of have covered that. And this is data that's been replicated and expanded upon. These are some of the studies. Detroit, was in that group that did the original LEAP study. The mechanisms have been looked at, because why is it that if sort of peanut is around, but you ingest the peanut, it seems to be safe? So there are several studies here. There's also the health nut study in Australia, which many of you are probably familiar with. And what's interesting about Australia is when the WHO came out with their guidelines, the different health regions in Australia, some said, yeah, we'll adopt these, and some said no. And the regions, because these are all genetically similar populations, the regions that adopted the peanut avoidance had an increase in peanut allergy, and that wasn't seen throughout the country. So here we're back to that LEAP baby. And the sunny side is the kids who are seeing these allergens through the gut the first time, because what we now know is there are many aspects of the intestines that help promote tolerance. As the allergen is taken up by dendritic cells, and you can see that happens regardless of exposure, the mesenteric lymph nodes, so those lymph nodes in the gut, help start a process that pushes us towards tolerance of the things we see in our gut. And are there mechanisms that fail on that front? Absolutely. But overall, even in these kids who have barrier trouble, so eczema, this promotes tolerance, early ingestion. And then the kids who have skin barrier trouble, who see things through the skin, those dendritic cells take up the antigen and present it to the same B cells, but you end up with Th2 instead of Th1 effects, and that is what's skewing us towards allergy. So the question then becomes, if we work on skin barrier protection, does it mitigate food allergy? And first, those studies looked at, if you start greasing up these babies, can you mitigate the eczema in the first place? And there is some data to that effect. Here's a schematic from that study that shows when you see those green tile-like cells, this is an intact skin barrier. And so it blocks the inflammatory cascade that leads to allergies that you see with a disrupted skin barrier. So that's a huge positive. Plus, when babies aren't scratching themselves bloody because they do not have the atopic dermatitis pathology happening in their skin, they look better, they're happier, they sleep, and that means happier families. So there's a lot to be said for aggressive and good skincare. So the question, does aggressive atopic dermatitis intervention mitigate food allergy, is clearly an important one. And there have been studies that focus on that. This came from our group, and that was published in Allergy last year. And this is a schematic from that, because we know that the genes didn't change. That's what led Gideon Lack and his group to do the LEAP study. The genes didn't change, it's the environment. And so the question is, what in the environment, what are we blocking that's changed? Because bacteria is the same, it's evolved a bit over time, same with viruses, they've evolved a bit, we're encroaching on different habitats and being exposed to new viruses. But overall, our genes haven't changed, so what are those factors? And it's delineating these that's leading a lot of research forward. And I want to get to a specific slide. Hold on. So this again is what we covered before with the LEAP baby. that the skin exposure can lead to these allergic mediators, and the GI exposure leads to protective responses. Where are we? So here, mechanisms by which atopic dermatitis predisposes to food allergy in the atopic march. Again, we know much more about this than we used to. And we finally have studies looking at whether or not intervening for eczema can halt food allergies. And what's exciting is we're recruiting for some of these studies now, but we finally know what we can do, be aggressive with skincare and introduce foods early. And I am nobody's clinician in this webinar, but the guidelines have been after 4 months and before 6 is when foods that are considered typical allergens should be introduced. Kids with eczema require reconsideration of that because the eczema has to be absolutely controlled. And these are conversations that need to happen early in the life of a child. And they're rough with new parents who are not used to the diaper changing and the sleepless nights. So for those of you out there who have young children with eczema, these are the conversations to have with pediatricians. And if you need referral to a dermatologist or an allergist, early is the time to get that. So that's more or less what I have to say, but I'm happy to look at questions.
All right, are you ready, Katie?
I'm ready.
All right, question 1. What do you think is the right age and too late age for starting OIT for peanuts?
Okay, that's a really brilliant question because there probably is no time that's too late. And one thing that can make me hesitant and has been an issue in the past, but is less so now, is I have always wanted a child who can say, my mouth is tingly or itchy, but we have plenty of kids who can talk and speak with their friends who don't want to talk when they go to the doctor. So there really is no age that's too young as long as you're in the hands of a competent clinic. And there's really no age that's too old because we know the immune system is flexible. In my local newspaper, there have been articles on this one guy. He was a twin and his brother died in the pandemic of 1918 and he survived the pandemic this time around. So the immune system can learn. It's true we have fewer naive T cells over time. Nobody is going to say that's not true, but the immune system is a malleable thing. Humans exist in every climate on this planet. And we're exposed to all kinds of flora and fauna, viruses and bacteria and foods. So the human immune system is malleable. There's always time for OIT. What's different about OIT as time goes on is the inclusion of biologics, say Xolair or Dupixent. And the thing is, some people probably absolutely have to have that to get where they need to go. Some people probably don't need it. If it were clear and straightforward, it wouldn't be such a conundrum. And I really sort of think if this were easy, these treatments would be out there. And there are probably some people for whom OIT as it is now in 2021 just isn't going to fly. But it's certainly worth trying with competent practitioners. What's the next question, Tina, if I got to that? I think I kicked it. Tina, do you have another question?
Yes, so it says, do kids plus skin tests consuming peanuts have allergic reactions while eating peanuts?
Okay. So that's a really good question because I think the answer comes in multiple parts. What the LEAP study showed is that a child can have, using their skin test material, right, that antigen product, whether it came from Bayer or Greer or ALK, because there are multiple suppliers, and that skin prick test device, there are several different options for that, who had the 1 to 4 millimeter skin prick test. There were some adverse events, but they were equivalent in the kids who were eating peanuts and not eating peanuts. So most of the kids did quite fine. Do some of those kids have a little tingling early on once the peanut is introduced? Based on the studies that are happening outside this storeroom now, yeah, there are some people who will have some tingling initially, and then they shouldn't. And one thing that it was clear formulating these protocols, so doing OIT in thousands and thousands of kids, is that when you're sick and your immune response is pulled in multiple directions, or with the onset of menarche, different things, then the threshold for reactivity can change. So I don't think anybody goes through OIT and is told you can throw away your EpiPen. The foundation for allergy is there, but can you change the day-to-day experience and improve the quality of life? That is a definite yes.
Sending the third question.
Okay.
For kids who had severe allergic reactions throwing up violently at 2 months, how can peanut be introduced?
Okay, so 2 months is generally considered sort of like before the window for introduction of foods, right? We know that if cow's milk goes in too soon, you can have problems, but the protein difference between cow milk, human milk, goat milk, sheep's milk is minimal, right? So 2 months is very early, but that's a child that needs to be seen by an allergy immunology specialist. And if food allergy immunotherapy is even on the table, you've got to go to a center that has experience. And don't forget that the kids who had big prick test response were not included in the LEAP study. So this is the vast majority of kids, but those kids who had really off the chart prick tests, because we're not looking at IgE here, there's no blood test. This was all straight up prick tests. The vast majority of kids, there was a place for them in this study. But throwing up violently at 2 months is terrifying, because that's a human organism without a lot of reserve, right? So that's a terrifying scenario, and I'm sorry that it happened, but 2 months is very young, and a solid evaluation for food allergy and immunotherapy a little later on, so that you can make decisions at the 4-month mark. That's where you need to go.
Next question is, how have you studied an individual who is allergic to all tree nuts but not peanut?
Okay, so I'm not sure about the study aspect, but the thing is, the principles and the guidelines for tree nuts are very similar to peanuts. What's nice about the studies that we're working on now, which are nearly all multi-allergen studies, is that, and probably this audience is familiar with this, but a pecan and a walnut, they look the same, and the proteins as they're seen by the body are pretty much the same. And the same is true for a pistachio and cashew. They just don't look so similar. So when we put kids and adults in these multi-allergen food studies, and we're using, say, cashew and not pistachio, we can do oral challenges at the end to pistachio, and it's as safe as it is for cashew and for pecan and walnut. So the principles are the same. You don't have to be allergic to peanut to be a candidate for allergy immunotherapy, but the studies we're running right now, the multi-allergen studies, we all have a little bit of peanut in those. Do you have other questions, Tina?
None actually are coming through. Are there any studies on how to switch skin-associated immune response to gut-associated?
That's a really good question. That's oral immunotherapy, right? We have these incredibly controlled situations. We evaluate kids and adults dramatically so that we can come up with sub-threshold doses, and then that's how we proceed. I mean, the immunotherapy is not something I'm comfortable with off this ward for foods, because I think it's a really dangerous, really cutting edge thing. But we're doing our studies on a hospital ward in really highly controlled settings, and that's what makes it safe. And the gain is that kids who are terrified to leave the house in case there's peanuts smeared on a jungle gym aren't terrified anymore, and families go to Legoland from the Bay Area because they know if they run out of safe snacks, they can go pick something up on the way. So these are really meaningful things, but every person is different. Every gut and skin setup is different. Otherwise we would have these protocols in every clinic in the country, and we just don't, because people are tough.
Sent you a question number 6. Are there learnings around food allergies, example, peanuts, and prevalence of environmental allergy shots while also undergoing OIT, which seems to be triggering atopic dermatitis?
Okay, I'm not sure. I mean, I see the question, but I can read that a couple different ways. So I'll give a bunch of answers and then please ask again if I miss it. When we introduce somebody to one of our studies, if they're on environmental allergy shots, which have been around now since Dr. Noon did them in London for well over 100 years, it's something like 112 years or so, people have to be on maintenance, right? Because the risk is in the buildup with environmental allergy shots. And the risk really doesn't ebb with oral immunotherapy. But when we are doing oral immunotherapy, we want our people stable. So they're on monthly allergy shots if they're doing allergy shots. And what we know for people who have atopic dermatitis, who are doing allergy immunotherapy, if the dose is kind of too high to start, then that can cause an eczema flare. And I was reading on one of the allergy immunology doctor message boards about someone who said he would never do allergy shots for someone with severe atopic dermatitis. But that's exactly the person who I think needs it most. You just have to start really low. So you start really low, you build, you make sure it's safe. And someone like that, once they're on maintenance immunotherapy for their environmental allergens, is a candidate for our studies. Our studies, when we work to desensitize to peanut or to tree nuts or to shrimp, the idea is not to trigger that eczema flare because then we've overshot the mark. The idea is to go in at a sub-threshold dose so that we don't stimulate allergic reactions. That's where the safety comes, and that's how we build back quality of life.
Question number 7, does having more things that you're allergic to make it harder for your immune system to adapt, learn?
That's a beautiful question, because one thing I just mentioned was if you're allergic to cashew and pistachio, to your body, that's usually just one thing. Most people who are allergic to cashew are going to be allergic to pistachio, and if you're desensitized to one, it should carry over to the other. In my professional life, I've had people come in with allergy test results and they're allergic to everything, but not everything is distinct. In America, for example, we have 3 main families of grasses, okay? So you could be tested to one grass in that family, and that going into your allergy shot mix is gonna work for all the grasses, or you could be tested to every single one of those grasses and say, 8 skin prick tests are all going to be positive, but you may have only needed 1. And your doctor may have done that because he wants to pick the worst offender to put into your mix. But there's no reason to think that more allergies is going to make it harder to desensitize. If we had those hard and fast rules, we'd be a much smarter species. The thing is, every person's really different. You can have one person who is stubbornly allergic to sesame and somebody whose immune system we can really adapt so that they go from not being able to eat tree nuts to being able to eat them safely. Do we have a question 8? Oh, yeah.
Sorry, I'm getting text.
Okay, so
oh, go ahead.
For question 8, these are conversations to have with a pediatrician or an allergist or a dermatologist, because the state of a child's skin really matters. If the skin barrier is not in good shape, that has to be dealt with. But the guidelines for food introduction for the allergenic foods, so peanuts, tree nuts, fish, shellfish, eggs, wheat, milk, sesame, the big 8, that's the 4 to 6 months. And the thing is, that's a conversation that has to be had with the pediatrician, because the relationship is really ruptured if the pediatrician is only comfortable introducing solids at 5 months, because that pediatrician is probably coming to the table with 12 or 24 or 30 years of experience. And there are situations, if you live in a ragweed heavy state, which is most of America, east of the Rockies, where the child's age at a given season might affect how that doctor thinks.
Question 9 on its.
Oh, that's a really good question. The question that shows data suggesting that lotion or emollient can affect food allergy sensitization. When I first got to UCSF, the man for whom we had an 85th birthday party every day used to rue the oat-based skin products because he said, you have children who can eat oatmeal every single day, but when you start rubbing it on their skin, they develop an allergy to oat. What goes on to skin makes a difference, right? And we're talking about skin that we're talking about like lesional skin, atopic dermatitis or eczema skin, and the conventional wisdom has swung at different times. Do you bathe and soak? Do you keep dry? And still the ultimate for severe eczema is wet wraps, right? Because we've got skin that's dry and sort of pulling apart, and we need it hydrated, so puffed up and damp. And then the moisturizers need to stop. And if there is antigen in those moisturizers, then we're going to run into trouble.
I think we only have time for one more question.
Okay.
Question number 10. Here you go.
So alternatives to peanut that offer more protection. Okay. So one thing that's been mentioned, and really it was in passing, is the use of biologics, different medicines that help sort of change the immune system, that make it easier and safer to pursue allergy immunotherapy to foods. And what you're talking about is sort of the holy grail, right? Is there like a silver bullet that's going to make this go away? And one study that we were working on here is the Matrix study, which is a T-cell vaccine for peanut allergy, period. If we administer this vaccine, do children lose their peanut allergy? And then how long does it take? And so that study is in the analysis stage now. But that's sort of the alternative to OIT, because I think every reasonable physician in America is terrified that what he or she is doing is going to be, you know, like the phrenology or the bleeding of today. And what we're doing is really very coarse. Oral challenges are not entirely objective. If somebody feels nauseated, I take their word for it. So you're absolutely right. There are multiple ways of achieving the same end, and the most humane and the safest and the least anxiety producing one is where we need to be. And that is why things like the Matrix study are being pursued. That is why if there's a dose or a schedule of, say, omalizumab that can be given to a child so that food allergies are a non-issue, that's being pursued. That's a really great question, because I mean, human beings are really different, and we have some sibling studies where, well, I can think of two sisters now where one is really doing brilliantly in a study and the other is really struggling because they're not the same. People are not the same, and that's why this is really rough. I'm really glad you could spend time with me today, and please reach out, because maybe we can help each other move forward.
Thank you so much, Katie, for your time, and everybody else joining us today.